for joining us. My name is Bonnie Claremont. That's my English name. My Ho-Chunk name, I'm a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and my Ho-Chunk name is Rajadanga, which means to be called upon woman. And I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we opened an office of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute about 21 years ago or so. So I've been with the Institute for that long. And just a quick little intro. What I have to share with you is the context is from my background, which is as an advocate. I worked as a domestic violence advocate, a rape crisis advocate, an advocate for many other crimes, major crimes especially, and also civil, such as domestic violence. But I worked with victims from all the different types of crimes and also their family members. And some of the families that I worked with had relatives who were murdered or even had gone missing. So, again, I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm very honored and pleased to provide you this information today. Um, and I really like to keep it pretty informal. So if you have any questions, you could put them in chat or a comment, and my awesome colleagues will monitor that for me. So, okay, forward. Marlon,
So sorry about that. On my
okay.
end, I have it geared up for learning objectives.
Yes, it's not up on my screen.
Do you see it now? The display?
No, I see your picture, no mine.
It's up on mine, Marlon. I'm wondering if Bonnie's bandwidth is down or
Up on mine too.
Oh
Do you want
dear.
me to? I'm happy to move on with the learning objectives while you all try to figure it out, or we can just wait.
I can share. I can share. Um, so today, I have a lot of information to share with you all. I'm not sure what's going on my end here. I apologize for the technical difficulties. But today I want to share with you the needs of victims of all of these different types of crimes and really to look at the immediate needs and how the crime has impacted a victim and their needs, and then also take a look at long-term needs. And within that scope, then their need for legal services, which are often really not available often in tribal communities. So these are the learning objectives up on your screen to identify the needs of victims of these crimes, including their emergent needs for safety, housing, court intervention, and also into long-term needs. And oftentimes those can be very complex. And I'll take you through a map of that. Also, for all of you to gain an insight into the challenges that victims often face seeking safety, obtaining protection orders in order to protect their children who may have witnessed abuse, to gain an understanding of the critical importance of victims having access to needed legal services, which is often non-existent in a lot of tribal communities. So this project is really meant to bring more legal services into tribal communities, to gain an appreciation and understanding of the possible lethality of situations without appropriate legal services. Next, next slide. So again, the impact of these crimes, and the one I have is based on sexual assault. And years back when I first started doing this work, it was, people often looked at the physical impact. So people looked at the victim and saw this victim who had no visible injuries, right? And they seemed to be communicating fairly well. But yet, for me, working with victims, even if they didn't have the visible physical injuries, there was a lot of, emotional harm that was done. There was harm even to their spirits, where, in our native philosophy or looking at this, it's like when you're sexually assaulted, oftentimes, your spirit leaves your physical being, in order to protect your mind, in order to protect your intellectual functioning. So there's a separation, and often our ceremonies are to recall that spirit back to the physical being. So there's an impact that oftentimes service providers may not see. And that, when we're talking about even the impact on someone's mind, with the perpetrators, constantly, if they're with that person for, a period of time where that perpetrator is saying, you're worthless, you're no good, you're a bad mother, the wrongdoing that you've done, you've helped me sell drugs. I'm going to report you to law enforcement that you're a drug dealer. And, when they know about this, you're going to lose custody of the children, and I'm going to get the children. And often those kind of threats, those kind of put downs, you're ugly, no one wants you, I'm the only one. And so, that can impact a victim's mind after a while. And once even leaving a situation like that, if you think about then how that's impacted that person's decision-making abilities, when they have to face a lot of, decisions that need to be made in a legal system. For example, even the decision whether they should report the crime to law enforcement can be challenging, right? And even just to protect themselves and their children and how they're going to do that and what the resources are, and even accessing those resources, such as shelter, and or protection orders, for example, those can all become really challenging for a victim, when they're already feeling like their decision making is been impacted negatively. So keeping this in mind as service providers within any capacity, it's important for us to remember that the impact of these crimes, of including sexual assault, can impact a person in a whole way, right? Their emotions, their physical being, where they may need to have forensic examination, where they may need to see a doctor for injuries, to record their injuries, and also for any kind of pregnancy prevention, and also the impact of their intellectual abilities, their decision making. So maybe they might tell you one story one way, but they may change only because, they're really confused after an assault occurs. And after they've done some healing, after they've gotten some support, maybe their thinking is a little clearer, and they can recall what happened a little clearer. And that, the change in those stories can have a negative impact on, if we're looking at, building a case for prosecution. Well, she keeps changing her story, right? So it's important to keep that in mind, that a victim may be confused, at the onset. Okay, next slide. So very briefly, overall needs of victims. I say safety, number one. Safety, safety, safety. That needs to be the first question that is asked. Is it safe for you to talk to me right now? Where are you? Are you safe there where you're talking to me from, that location? If you're talking to someone over the phone, for example. to make sure that their situation, that they're in a safe place. And if not, to address that, to provide that person with options of what needs to happen in order for that person to feel safe. Or even to ask about their children. Are their children safe? Do they feel like their children are safe right now? Also, even after a victim leaves a situation, doesn't mean they're going to be safe, right? Because oftentimes that's where the violence can escalate because that the perpetrator is now losing control over that person, so they're going to escalate their tactics, right? So it may even some of the threats may even be directed towards the victim's kinship circle and their relatives and their family and their friends even. They want that kind of safety. They want that kind of protection. So that all needs to be built into a protection order or a harassment restraining order. Um, because often these threats, like I said, can result in some critical situation, and the lethality level can build to where that perpetrator may threaten to kill that victim, to kill the children, to kill himself. And we've seen that happen in a lot of instances. Confidentiality and privacy, those are, I call them cornerstones for safety. Every victim has the right to confidentiality. That's one of their rights. And those need to be protected. She or he needs to be informed of their right to confidentiality and privacy, to in this day and age where we have technology, privacy is becoming much more of a challenge. So it's important to look at that and also discuss that if that's an issue for the victim. And every victim has rights, right? When they've been harmed by a crime, they have a right to information. They have a right to be informed of all the steps that are being taken within a criminal justice system. They have a right to know where their perpetrator is. Has that person been jailed, arrested and jailed? Has that person been released? And so forth. Victims have a right to that. So we have resources uh, to help you inform victim of their rights as needed. And we're also really trying to work with tribes to have victim rights laws. So that's also, so critical as far as keeping victims safe. If children are involved, oftentimes there's custody issues because especially in domestic violence situations, often children are used as pawns in that situation where the perpetrator will threaten the victim if they leave or if they're not being compliant with the perpetrator's demands, that they threaten the victim that they're going to take the children, and the non-offending parent will lose custody. Oftentimes there's housing issues. There may be, eviction notices because of, the disruptive behavior that's happening in the home. Or maybe there's damages to the home, or maybe the victim hasn't paid the rent. So now they're being threatened with eviction. And because the perpetrator's taken the money and is controlling the finances, there's also employment rights involved where victims often have to take leave due to abuse. They don't want to show up at work with a black eye. Or there's problems with childcare because, they don't want to leave their children because they're afraid the perpetrator will take the children. So there's a lot of ways that a victim can be impacted in their workplace, or even where the perpetrator is stalking the victim in their workplace. Because after a victim leaves a situation like domestic violence, that doesn't end, like I said before, that doesn't always end of abuse. In fact, it can escalate where the perpetrator is now stalking everywhere the victim goes. So when we talk about harassment restraining orders, it's important to consider all of that. Like where are they being stalked? Where shall we include places where the victim should be able to go, where that perpetrator isn't going to stalk them and continue to show up at those places? So places like convenience stores or tribal community centers and so forth, where uh, facilities that are owned and operated by the tribe. They have control over that. They can also, keep the perpetrator from going there while the victim is there. Ability to work and attend classes without fear of being stalked. So we're talking about even situations of dating violence where they may not the two may not be married, but the perpetrator is stalking them. Say if they're both attending the local community college, and the victim is maybe in the same class as the person who assaulted them or raped them. They need to have some kind of protection while they still attend classes, for example, or where they want to use the computer lab. They don't want that person to continue showing up there. So even that, they need some protection against that stalker. Um, and also minors seeking protection. Minors, they're often not able to obtain protection orders. And all of this will be shared by my colleague Kelly Stoner as she does her series in the legal protections that victims have, and go delve a little bit deeper into some of the legal resources that victims may have. But minors are often challenged in terms of seeking protection. Also, because minors may not want their parents to know about when they're assaulted because maybe they were out doing things they weren't supposed to do. And as in that process, they were assaulted. So it makes it even more challenging for that kind of victim to receive some confidentiality and to receive services without their parents knowing, because often they have to have parents' permission for certain kind of procedures. Um, Culturally appropriate victim-centered trauma-informed response. Again, that's an overall need of every victim. When, from tribal communities in particular, they need to have people that understand who they are, where they come from, and a little bit about their history and their culture. Next slide. So I've shared some of these safety, just being able to uh, be safe, and also to have their privacy, their confidentiality, their victim rights upheld. If there's a violation of that, they may need legal services to address that because that's against the law. Victims have a right to have their victim rights upheld. Um, Denial and minimizing of problems of sexual assault, domestic violence in tribal communities. Again, that continues to be a problem. Where there's advocacy programs that tends to help that, where advocates have gone out and done some training and also are participating in teams with other service providers and responders, where they're able to do some cross-discipline kind of training and so forth. But where there are no advocacy programs or those teams established, there's still a lot of denial and minimizing about the problem of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking. And I've seen that firsthand as I visit tribal communities. Tribal communities are often very under-resourced. Not all tribes have gaming. So their resources are very limited. And there has to be, a proponent to create these kind of services that victims often need, because they're looking at where to best place their resources, and often that may not be because of the underreporting. If victims aren't reporting, even in small communities, then that tribal leadership may not fully understand that there are crimes that are happening, and that there should be services that are addressing the victims of those crimes, right? Um, And also, still the challenge of victims not, being hesitant about utilizing services and any kind of services, right? But obviously, there's need for the services. There's a need for those services to be established and to be made available and accessible to victims, and including legal services. And there's a lot of good reasons why victims are hesitant, because there's that historic trauma. They've had bad experiences with law enforcement, with the courts, and so forth, that still contribute to their lack of trust in utilizing any kind of service because historically their children have been taken, that they've been removed from them, even from non-offending parents for a lot of reasons that are not justified. Um, so there's still that history that we're addressing. We also have now the Violence Against Women Act, which has been reauthorized several times. We have the Violence Against Women Act that was reauthorized in 2013, that provided that special tribal criminal jurisdiction. Well, before that, the 2013, the special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction that we were able to see passed by Congress, where tribes now have a little bit more authority over non-natives who are violating protection orders, for example. And then in 2022, that was further expanded to the special tribal criminal jurisdiction, where there's additional crimes that are covered that weren't previously covered in the previous VAWA reauthorization. So Kelly will be doing a little bit more on that, which I'm so excited. I'm so happy. And we have opportunities for tribes to create the kind of the what's needed in order to exercise criminal jurisdiction. So we have, those things that are happening that I'm truly excited about because there's crimes like sexual assault that previously tribes didn't have control over when it was committed by non-natives. Next slide.
Hey, Bonnie,
Yes.
we got Rhonda
Okay.
has her hand raised.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you wanted to put her question in the chat or how you'd like to handle this.
Maybe in chat. I don't know. Unless
Okay.
she wants to unmute or oh, she said she's fine.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So the crimes of the needs of victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence. I'm not seeing the slide, so to the continuum, the next slide. So this continuum, I've used this a number of times in my trainings, and it shows on your left end the causes, what contributes to sexual assault occurring, right? And I've seen things like attitudes that contribute to that, or even just denial, not wanting to address the fact that sexual assaults occurs in their communities, denial, minimizing, and not taking an aggressive approach to prosecution, building strong cases, working together collectively as service providers and those in the criminal justice field and so forth on creating cases, when they're reported or removing the barriers to reporting so that victims feel their trust is increases to utilize the system that's there for them. So the causes on this left end, which then contributes to sexual assault where there isn't any contact, right? Um, so can you think of sexual assaults where there may not be any physical contact? I think I mentioned one earlier that's utilizing a system that we didn't always have in order for perpetrators to sexual assaults where there may not be any physical contact, stalking. Yep. Social media, absolutely. And it's getting pretty rampant, where it's kind of a free for all. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen on just warning people about how to not use it or protect themselves or because it's increasing, the kind of activity that's happening there, the type of inappropriate comments and um, offensive behavior that's happening using social media. But yes. And then there used to be things like obscene phone calls or, um, exposure, people exposing themselves inappropriately to others, like to children, the use of child pornography, for example, where there isn't any physical contact. And then from there, it can go into, and grooming, absolutely. Thank you. And then, contact, actual physical contact, where we start to see crimes then with physical contact of the person, the victim's body, with the genitals, for example, including the breasts and buttocks. And then it goes into penetration with objects, with the fingers, an object with the penis, for example, into the victim's body. So, and then often it can escalate to homicide or death. So we look at the lethality of, we talk about the causes and we look at how can we stop this even right at the causes? How can we address the causes? So I say again to look at, our communities really talking about this problem. Are they coming together in teams, forming teams? Are they working across jurisdictions in order to hold offenders accountable, in order to keep victims safe? Because that's where we can start to address this problem, the problem of sexual assault, but any crime for that matter. Okay.
Hey, Bonnie, there was a
Uh,
question about protocols or procedures um, when victims want to report abuse or grooming by spiritual leadership.
It's really difficult. We talk about native spiritual leaders. I've done a lot of training, and here locally, we had a number of conferences addressing this very problem because I was involved in a number of cases where the perpetrator was a native spiritual leader. And it's difficult because that grooming process is so hidden, is so secretive until something actually happens or until that victim is able to talk to someone, just like sexual assault, right? And I say over and over again, spiritual leaders are not, we have to be careful about putting them up on that pedestal, right? And not to hold them above the law, because often when they're reported, when their crimes are reported, it's like people come to their aid because they say, well, that person is a good family man and he's helped us so much when we needed it and he was there for us and provided prayers and ceremonies. And so that's what often happens, right? So it's important for us to hold them equally accountable for the crimes they choose to commit because they hold the power that we don't often see. They're not maybe physical kind of power, but they hold other kinds of power with people's trust, right? Especially children and young women and young adults by telling them, the creator tells me in my vision that you're going to be the next spiritual leader and the holder of this pipe, and you need to follow my direction. So they become sort of in entranced or whatever you call it with this person. So it's really important for us to provide that kind of education that anyone can commit these crimes, that no one is above the law. And there's certain red flags, I always call them. So there's a whole training that I've done, to help people recognize those red flags. So absolutely, if you're interested in receiving some training like that, let us know. I've done a lot of training and I've also developed some resources to address this type of crime that still continues to happen. I hope that helps. You could email me directly also, and I can provide you some more information. Next slide. So quickly, I've already mentioned a lot of these safety The victims may need protection orders. They need safety planning while they're at home, safety planning while they're at work, safety planning while they're even in the courts, to understand what's going to happen if they are looking at obtaining a protection order, what's going to happen when, the perpetrator is going to be served, and what's likely to happen, talk about that with the victim. What are they concerned about when this perpetrator served with the papers that a protection order has been filed with the courts? Um, Safety at school, safety with their children going to school. Should the school be notified of the protection order so that, the perpetrator doesn't, abduct them from the school? Um, so these are all safety measures that need to be taken. Safety is always number one importance. Employment, like I said before, there's often victims that are being sexually harassed in the workplace that may need legal services, that may need legal help. Sometimes even the tribe can be their employer, and sexual harassment may be happening right there in their workplace. I've worked with a lot of victims where that's happening. They might benefit from maybe some mediation with their employer. I don't know if that's an option. And again, in order to help victims regain some sense of power and control, it's important to follow their lead as far as what they want to do, decisions that they make. And good information is going to help them make informed decisions. Okay. Housing, like I said before, there may be circumstances where a victim was raped in her residence or his residence and may not want to even reside there anymore, or there may be changes that need to happen as a result of the crime that was committed in the victim's home. They may need to break their lease, so they may need some legal help there as well. Um, they may need to gain possession of their residence. Maybe the residence is in their perpetrator's name, and that's going to maybe look at as being some kind of precedent in a case. So all of these things may result in a victim needing legal help. Um, Education, again, like I said before, they may need help to look at having some protection in as they attend school. They may want to continue attending classes. What does that mean? They may need some help there. And, if the school, often if they're assaulted on the college campus, oftentimes the school may not want to deal with it because they don't want their school to look bad. They don't want to, discourage any students from attending classes there, or, because they may receive some kind of payments or tuition payments or whatever that they don't want to see, dismissed because of crimes that are happening. So they may dismiss this, the assault that happened. It's important to look at, what does the victim want to do? And if they want to attend classes, then there needs to be some other measures taken, maybe meeting with the dean of the students or the dean of the college, the president of the college, for example, in order for some kind of resolutions to take place. So these are all options that victims, legal needs that victims may have, and some of them can become really complex. So, okay, next slide. And I've already talked about dating violence to some extent. Oftentimes it's difficult again for victims to seek some remedies, legal remedies to be safe, to keep them safe. But again, these crimes can escalate into someone threatening to kill the victim or even to commit suicide, for example, and also the use of even technology, social media. Next slide. So again, legal needs for victims of dating violence, safety, number one. What are their concerns about their safety and for protection from further harm? So yes, a harassment restraining order. Sometimes they may need their parents' consent in order to receive a protection order. Um, And again, the ability to attend classes if that's, if that's an issue. Okay, next slide. Stalking. Stalking is a crime of power and control. It's a course of action directed at an individual that causes the victim to fear for their safety and generally involves repeated visual or physical proximity, non-consensual communication, and verbal, written, or implied threats. Okay. Involves repeated actions like unwanted phone calls, following the victim, sending unwanted items, and so forth. So it's like a constant presence that the victim really does not want, that they want that to cease and stop. This is often commonly seen in other forms of violence where, in domestic violence, for example, once the victim leaves, stalking can increase. And again, that's part of that power and control on the part of the perpetrator. It can be charged as primary criminal act against a victim. And Kelly, I'm hoping we'll take this a little further as far as options for victims. Stalking not taken seriously, but thought to be acts perpetrated by someone who's mentally ill. We've seen that with performers, movie stars that are being stalked by people who are kind of obsessed with them. But that's not all the stalking that happens, of course. It happens right in our own tribal communities. So okay, often we also see it as a tool of witness intimidation in criminal cases. If I just make my presence known to the victim, to her or him, that that she's going to have to deal with me and she needs to, stop this case and not, proceed further. That's kind of the message the perpetrator is trying to send to the victim to back off. Okay, next slide. Legal needs for victims of stalking, safety, of course, because we don't want to see this where this is going to continue to escalate. So, a harassment restraining order to stop the stalking is important, to put a stop to it, to file a police report so that there's record of it that could result in criminal charges. And then also that safety planning and encouraging the victim to keep a log of the incidents so that they have some written, information that they can present to law enforcement or to the courts. And also civil action may be an option, like to file a personal injury lawsuit and to look at the harm, the damages that stalking has caused. Next slide. So I've used this power and control wheel in my previous webinar, and it just shows that the primary motive for all of these different types of crime is for power and control. So you hear me mention that numerous times. This wheel has been used for many years. It was developed out of the Duluth model in Duluth, Minnesota, many, many years ago. And the spokes are the tactics of abusers. So again, when I talk about the impact on the earlier slide, how these crimes impact a victim, it's these tactics that can result in the impact on the victim. And the outside is the actual crimes that we see then that often get reported, but we may not see all the tactics behind how children are used in these situations. Economic abuse, where a perpetrator is withholding finances, for example, and so forth. So this is a wheel, power and control wheel that's been around for quite a while. Next slide. Again, legal needs for victims of domestic violence, protection orders, warrants that can result in arrest of the perpetrator, also warrants that there might be against themselves. It's a reason why a lot of victims may not want to utilize the criminal justice system because they have a warrant. And, I've been on teams where we worked out with law enforcement that that they would maybe minimize or I don't know what the legal word is to set aside that warrant for a misdemeanor because what's happening to the victim is more of a major crime, a more serious crime that should be addressed versus She has a warrant for a parking violation. And it's now gone into where her license has been suspended, and now it's gone into a warrant for her arrest. So it's like, well, okay, so we look at this warrant for a parking ticket versus her being stalked and potentially could end up in a lethal situation. Housing, again, like I mentioned before, may have legal needs for housing. The Violence Against Women Act also has some provisions in there to protect victims from being evicted, and I'm hoping that Kelly will share more of that in her webinars when we get into some of the legal information. Child custody. Like I said, oftentimes perpetrators will threaten victims within all these crimes. Oh, well, you have a child or you have children. I know you have children, so you better watch what you're saying, what you're doing, because I'll report you. Okay. And often domestic violence involves the use of firearms. The victim, the perpetrator has firearms. If they are able to obtain a protection order, then they can also be protected from that perpetrator possessing and using those firearms, because often we see some of those ending up in a pretty lethal situation. So that can also be addressed within protection orders. Next slide. Um, I don't want to go too far into this because this itself can be a whole webinar in and of itself, but it's so important that when we talk about the kind of services wherever those services are being provided from, that they be trauma informed, understanding the fact that this particular crime has impacted this person in that whole person way. But also as Native people, we have a whole history of trauma, right? And we carry some of that history within us. We don't leave it way in the past, right? It's still with us. It's part of who we are. It's part of the fabric of who we are. So it's important to keep that in mind because it contributes to, the lack of trust and the reason why a lot of reports aren't being made. And even once reports are made, oftentimes victims are very cautious about what kind of information they're going to share because they're afraid their children might be removed from them for no reason, for no justifiable reason. The response should be victim-centered. It's like, what are the needs of this victim? And number one is safety, like I said. So working with that victim from a trauma-informed, victim-centered response includes all of these factors, right? And the bottom one says working in partnership with individuals and communities, promoting agency and choice. So it's so important that we work across jurisdictions, we work across disciplines in order to create that trauma-informed, victim-centered response within that community for victims. Next slide. Again, like I said, any of these crimes can result in lethality in very lethal situations. When a victim leaves an abuser, sometimes that behavior, that violence can escalate to where, it can end up in homicide. So it's important that we stop it early on and we that seek some protection. And also to get the courts to grant temporary custody of the children through that protection order. Um, and also, it can result in lethality when an abuser is ordered to vacate the premises. They have a strong sense of ownership. This is my house. It's in my name. I pay the rent here. When actually maybe that's not happening, right? But can use that scenario to their advantage. Um, when a victim files for a protection order and the perpetrator is served, that's when violence can also escalate. So every step along the way, so critically important for victims to be made aware of when those things are happening. If victim calls law enforcement or reports abuse to law enforcement, again, making those calls is a huge step, and the victim needs to be acknowledged for taking that step, because then it's a step towards seeking protection and safety. And this all means that the abuser is losing control, which, again, like I said, may escalate into more violence or homicide. Next slide. Important factors to consider for anyone providing services to victims of violence in tribal communities. Understand the services provided by a tribal victim services program. So become familiar with the services. Understand the importance of maintaining confidentiality as a critical factor to safety and the safety needs of a victim and the victim's family. I can't stress that enough. Can't stress that enough, that confidentiality and a victim's right to it is so critically important to their safety and well-being. Because once that leaks out, that again can risk that victim's safety. Understand the importance of collaboration with other tribal and non-tribal agencies to meet the needs of victim survivors. Learn the tools to work with tribal advocates, right? Know who your tribal advocates are because they're a great resource. Some areas there's coalitions that cover a broad geographic area in the kind of services, the training technical assistance services they provide. Understand tribal cultural beliefs, concepts of values, and their ceremonial times. I'll talk a little bit more about this in my next webinar, which you're all welcome to participate in, and I invite you all. Next slide. Again, this is continued. Explore your own beliefs, feelings, and judgments about common myths and facts about domestic violence and so forth. Educate yourself about that. If you're wanting to work across jurisdictions or you're in a situation where you're able to provide those legal services, to understand more about, what's going on for that tribal community even. Understand the survivor's risk, and I've talked a lot about that. Understand, recognize the power and control tactics of an abuser and the lethality. Center responses on victim empowerment, right? Involve their decision making at every juncture. Understand how children are affected by witnessing domestic violence and abuse. Next slide. So I want to take you just on a quick path. And with the understanding that this is the path that often many battered women have to walk. And, when we talk about, we often say the words, well, if she just would leave the situation, right? Then everything will be okay. But we don't often think about what happens when the victim makes that decision. It's a huge, huge decision, right? And some of this also applies to some of the other crimes that we're talking about. So I ask you to keep that in mind as well. And I'm going to go through them fairly quickly just because we are running out of time. Next slide. These slides were created by Praxis International, but they really tell a big story in them. It's mapping the domestic violence response. And often when I'm on site, particularly on site, I like to take participants through this walk so that you can see firsthand. And there's some exercises even doing it in person, which I really like. To be able to walk in the shoes of a victim, I think is really important to really grasp what they're experiencing. And because, as they walk through this system, it brings complex and immediate needs for safety. We recognize that at every juncture. And we need to work to enhance the safety of victims while recognizing how multiple systems play a role in that person's life. Next slide. So this is when the victim first reports and there's a response that happens, that 911 call is made. So you'll see all the steps that happen. At every one of these steps, every one of these junctures, basically I want to say her life is on the line. She's putting her life on the line for herself and her child because there's that potential that that violence can escalate. Okay, next slide. And this is when the report is made about domestic violence and the arrest can occur. This is a shelter map. Oftentimes she's referred to a shelter. These are all the things that take place in a shelter. Okay, there's intake, there's things that residents are responsible to do. There's options that are made available to her that she oftentimes will participate in. She also has children, maybe if she has children that have school needs, that's also something that has to be attended to. So these are all the things that happen within a shelter setting. Next slide. If she has a case involving child protection, either one that she has when she leaves the violent situation, or maybe one that just comes up now because they're being reported for some kind of abuse or neglect, maybe a case opens up then. This is the whole process that she may have to go through in a child protection case. She'll be assigned a worker and so forth, and certain provisions made to either get her children back away from the system or to keep them from going into the system. Okay, next slide. This is the housing map. If she's living in tribal housing, there's certain rules they have to adhere to, not to mention any kind of tribal politics that might be happening. Okay. Next slide. She wants safety, so she files for an order for protection. This is the court process in order to get a protection processed and or filed and processed and ordered, and to have that relief granted. Okay, next slide. He's threatening, or the violent partner is threatening to take custody. Oftentimes perpetrators, because they control finances, may have access to funds in order to hire an attorney. And being left without those financial resources, she doesn't have the means to hire an attorney, and is concerned about losing custody of her children. Okay. Next slide. So if you put all of this together, this is often what a lot of victims of domestic violence have to face, along with her own feelings about being assaulted by someone she trusted, being assaulted by an intimate partner, being assaulted by a coworker, being assaulted by someone she's had children with and been with for a number of years, and now is having to leave that situation, having to report her partner, report this person for the crime that they've chosen to commit. And she has to go through all of this. And oftentimes the perpetrator is not. Yes, in protection orders, yes, that perpetrator has to appear if they choose. Otherwise, the protection order is granted. Next slide. So I ask you to think about that. Think about the impact of what this victim is having to deal with, in addition to the impact of that the trauma has had on him or her. So I just say, however your agency can help victims that are seeking safety, that's the number one thing, is seeking safety for themselves and their children, is so critically important to be able to create resources that are accessible, to educate the kind of resources that you have available to be able to help victims that are dealing with this, is so critically important. Next slide. Because victims' needs are oftentimes very complex. And we have huge reservations, but often they're divided into smaller communities. Batterers are transient. Well, in those communities, privacy, confidentiality needs are greater because everyone knows everyone in those communities, and oftentimes those communities have names, right? There might be this huge reservation, but you have plots of tribal communities, right? And people reside in those communities, and everyone knows everyone in those communities. And they travel to other parts of the reservation for whatever reason they need services or ceremonies or whatever. So confidentiality needs are greater. batters oftentimes are very transient. They're attending powwows during the summer. Victims can see their batter at powwows, and there's also that threat that the batter is going to abduct with the children at that powwow. They have a protection order. They want to get it served because that batter is violating that protection order by doing whatever they're doing at that powwow. But that community there, that law enforcement place, they're not recognizing that protection order. This is where full faith and credit may come into effect. So my colleague again will address more issues related to full faith and credit, and I'll touch on it at the next webinar. Um, there's that historic distrust of outside service providers because of the history that we've experienced. Victims often have to travel great distances from remote areas. Some of our tribal communities are up in mountains. Challenges having protection orders enforced by other jurisdictions that I just mentioned. Lack of formalized agreements between jurisdictions to address crimes. This is where we need to come together more to be able to provide services across jurisdictions. Under-resourced departments and responders. Some tribes may not even have a law enforcement agency, and they have to rely on outside jurisdictions. Next slide. Okay, so we just need to continue to educate ourselves about how these all become the barriers and how we can work to remove the barriers. In addition, also the helping family and friends of victims, the need for sound advocacy, even encouraging local tribes to work more cooperatively with their advocacy programs because they're a great resource. Um, and then also just the cross training needed among disciplines, cross disciplines across jurisdictions. That's such a need, a great need. Once the victim calls 911, all of this is set in motion. Is it going to be successful for that victim to seek safety, or is it going to end up in something lethal? We all can have a part in having a positive outcome for that victim, which is a need for collaboration and cooperation across disciplines and jurisdictions. And I'll talk more about in my webinar number 3, which is coming up in September 17th. Next slide. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm always available by email. This is where my office is currently, but email is the best way to reach me. Also, check out our website, which is not a great one that's listed here, but I also have my phone number. If you want to call me, I'm also available there. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry to be a little bit over, but thank you for staying with us. And again, I invite you to the next webinar, which is September 17th. Same time, same station. Marlon?
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. As our presenter had indicated, we'll be sending a recording of this session along with the PowerPoint deck to folks who have registered. And also as a reminder, if you could please kindly fill out our evaluation. The QR code is up on the screen, and shortly we'll have it. Suzanne already went ahead and dropped that into the chat. And a little bit more about the webinar series. Our apologies for folks who weren't able to join, but we'll revisit those settings to make sure everyone can join with more ease on part 3. The webinar series, as mentioned, is a 3-part series brought to you by TLPI as a TTA provider for the Legal Advocacy Legal Assistance for Victims, LAV for short, Expanding Legal Services Initiative, grantees and other legal services located on or near tribal communities. As shared, the next upcoming webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, September 17th. This is a reoccurring webinar series, so we hope that you can use the same registration link. And if you have any difficulties or troubles, you can also email me at marlon@tlpi.org. That upcoming session is called Reaching Across Jurisdictional Boundaries to Address Victim Safety and promote offender accountability, responding to crimes of domestic violence and sexual assault. Again, thank you to everybody who will participate in our evaluation. We're going to go ahead and end the recording, but we will leave the screen up so that way folks can go ahead and grab that link. But before we, no, you
Thank
just
you,
had one,
Marlon.
you had one thank you in the Q&A. There's no other questions in the chat or Q&A, Bonnie. Thank
Okay.
you again.
Thank you, Marlon, Kelly, Suzanne.